The views and opinions expressed on the show are those of the guests or hosts, and not necessarily those of the advertisers, networks, platforms, or stations. Warning that the content of the show may not be suitable for all audiences, and that viewer discretion is advised. The show does not intend to provide medical, legal, or financial advice, and viewers or listeners should consult with a professional before making any decisions based on the information presented.
Welcome back, everybody, to Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio live worldwide. We are broadcasting from an abandoned nuclear missile silo 300 feet deep, lost in the post-apocalyptic radioactive wastelands of the Dakota Territories. And I am your host, Jack Carey, and I have a voice for radio and a face for milk cartons. And I'm joined, as always, by the paranormal crime-fighting duo, Miss Daisy and the Sundance Kid, working security in the silo tonight. And high above us, believe it or not, swarming in what they call an eclipse are droves of Mothmen. They are glowing, radioactive in the night, and they are looking for human flesh, so beware. I don't expect any of them will get into the silo tonight, but we are keeping an eye out, and this, as usual, has been one of those crazy weeks. They're all crazy right now as we're going through this weird phase of the upswing of the Kali Yuga. So that's actually a pretty cool place to be if you're part of the human species. However, if you're unaccustomed to surfing these cosmic waves as they're coming in, you can get a little bit seasick, a little bit queasy with all of the, turbulence that's taking place in our event stream. And this is something we've been talking about on an ongoing basis in our cyber prophecy part of the show. And I always like to remind everybody our cyber prophecy part of the show is really made up of not only the WebBud, but of the findings of premier remote viewing groups around the world, the Schumann Resonance Indicator, Vedic astrology, and ancient predictions all coming together into a singular whole, into a singularity of paranormal, if you will. And we're kind of right in the midst of a major turbulent time here in our event stream, and that's the month of July. We're coming up to a close on July, and that's okay because going into August, we're still going to have quite a bit of stuff taking place, but it's not going to be quite as stressful as a lot of stuff that occurred in July. Then there's a major uptick that takes place in the fall. And that's something that is very, very interesting because, as we'll see tonight, there's a lot of good stuff happening on paranormal in the news that is going to sort of come to play in the fall. It was just announced last couple of days that there's going to be yet another UAP hearing by the Congress and the Senate. The Senate Intelligence Committee and the Committee for, I believe, their Armed Forces Committee, something like that, are both having them. And it's interesting because they had Representative Scott Burleson on News Nation talking about how difficult it's been for him to get firsthand eyewitnesses from the programs themselves to appear before Congress and the Senate because of their fear of reprisals. For instance, David Grush, one of the major whistleblowers to come out, the guy who said that we had recovered both craft and so-called biologics, lost his pension, lost all of his benefits, lost everything. And it's interesting, though, he is being employed by Congressman right now, David Grush, to actually get certain witnesses to agree to appear before this committee. And we'll see how many of them actually appear that are firsthand witnesses, because that's who they need to hear from. They need to hear from the people that are working on the craft. They need to hear from the people that are working on the alien bodies, the actual scientists that are there every day with the bodies and with the craft. That's who they need to hear from for anybody to begin to fully accept it, because, you know, I'll remind our listeners that along with the disclosure of all of this kind of stuff comes a severe amount of ontological shock, something Whitley Strieber talked about in an interview this week, and we're going to get to a lot of what Whitley Strieber had to say this week. Was fascinating in the context of last week's conversation dealing with Skinwalker Ranch and the Demiurge, and it also leads us into a lot of other fascinating ideas and discoveries. You know, I went down an exotic, very strange rabbit hole this week dealing with holographic universe theory, and we're going to be discussing some of that tonight. It really kind of, as usual, all bleeds together into a singular whole. But getting back to our cyber prophecies, we're right in that in the throes of when you're going to see major economic change take place too. Interestingly enough, the Webbot has long predicted
Trump's crypto revolution is just getting started, and this AI finds the smaller coins that benefit most from the boom he triggered. I've been making anywhere from $50 to $300 a day with this simple app. Get wins like this, all you need is $27 and a smartphone.
The point of financial turmoil that takes place right before things like cryptocurrency sort of take over economies, and they become the accepted form of like currency, etc. So it's interesting then that the Congress and the Senate and the president signed into law three new bills dealing with cryptocurrency. That's really interesting, because the Webbot predicted this years and years ago, and here you got to see it manifest right before our eyes in the form of these three bills. Now there's literally nothing that's going to stand in the way of its predictions for, say, like Bitcoin to come true, which, you know, this clears the way for so-called institutional retirement type funding to actually flow into these Bitcoin ETFs, into Bitcoin itself. And that's really all that's required for it to take off and fulfill the predictions that were projected by the Webbot decades ago. Whenever Bitcoin was down in the penny range, it was saying that eventually people will own a tiny, tiny little fraction of a Bitcoin, right? A tiny little fraction of one, and you'll still be a millionaire. That's how valuable it becomes over time. So, you know, that's interesting stuff. Who knows if any of the other cryptos take off or not? I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a paranormal analyst, but that's very interesting stuff. And it coincides with this whole changing of our economy, coincides with the prediction that the money used to cover up the alien technology dries up in such a way that this stuff becomes readily known to people, right? And that's the disclosure that we're facing. Ross Coulthart this week brought up some interesting points. He makes the point that it looks like people in the Trump administration have so-called drunk the Kool-Aid, meaning that they have fallen prey to the same people in the military-industrial complex who are convincing even senior Congress and senators, congressmen and senators that who have been read into the UFO programs. We're going to get to that because some of these guys have been read in. But, they're being basically lied to. These senators, the congressmen, the president, they're all hearing from people in the Pentagon telling them, look, this is crucial that we beat our enemies to the weaponization of this alien technology. If we can't beat them to the weaponization of this technology, then whoever wins that race will end up ruling this planet. If you're a senator and this is all new to you and it's a problem that you don't want to have to deal with to begin with, and there's aliens and, and this general's telling you, no, don't talk about it because this is vital to our national security, of course they're going to keep it a secret. They're never going to go against that. And that literally leaves us with the only thing left, which is so-called catastrophic disclosure. I find it fascinating then that Russ Coulthard also had on this week a scientist he's probably the premier radar scientist on the planet. A guy that's, invented many different kinds of radars and what have you. And he has come up with a brilliant and fascinating idea that has already been proven works. They're just now trying to accumulate $5 million to be able to actually put these things into production that will then be sold out to you and I, the public. And I'm talking about a new type of passive radar that's no bigger than a modem that you would buy. Retail cost is going to be about $500. It automatically networks with everybody else that has one of these passive radars, and it networks with their Skywatch program, which is centralized to this entire passive radar network. This guy discovered that you could use existing radio waves as a passive radar and track UFO movements that way and in such a way that they can't be hidden. So imagine, in effect, a future very shortly where you'll be able to purchase a $500 UFO detector that will sit in your house and literally detect anomalous craft as they fly overhead. And you will be part of a network of these taking place all around the country. And all of that information will be fed to a central computer that then can feed it into a model and show exactly where all of these craft are flying, where they're going to, where they're coming from, everything in like 3D. That's going to be crazy. And there's really, unless the government, he says, government officials have not stepped in yet to discuss this matter. And he doesn't think that they will for whatever reason. He has a couple of theories as to why he's not been approached by the guys in black suits about it, but maybe they don't think it'll work, or maybe they think they'll not be able to raise the money to be able to actually produce these things. I don't know, but it is fascinating if they're able to get it off the ground. And it is, actually used by the public, that would fulfill the Webbot prediction that true disclosure comes about from the populace itself. It doesn't trickle down from the top. It actually comes from the population, and the population then begins to spontaneously make all kinds of changes that can no longer be controlled by the top. That's really how it describes it in a nutshell. That's the easy way to describe it. And to remind everybody, we are in this area of the Kali Yuga, this planetary movement that we go through, where we have popped out of this debris field that normally blocks us from galactic center. And now we're getting bombarded with these rays, and it's causing all kinds of change to occur and take place. And these are the times when you're on the upswing of the Kali Yuga. Eventually that leads to the top of the cycle, and the top of the cycle is like another golden age. So, yeah, that's not so bad. But today is a major holy day. And our main topic is going to be the fact that today is the day of the Bado, guys. This is a major day at the PIA. We celebrate it every single year. This is the day when the Dogon tribe of Western Africa, who weren't discovered until 1935 by two French anthropologists, believe that special signals emanate on this day from the star Sirius, the star system Sirius, because there's actually Sirius A, B, and C. But special signals emanates from there, and these special signals actually interact with our star, and our star then interacts with our planet on a vibratory and energetic level, and it literally alters biological life on this planet. In other words, you might be seeing the very mechanism, or they're describing the very mechanism through which biological evolution takes place throughout the universe. And so what we're going to talk about tonight is that idea as our main topic, because it is July 23rd and today is that day. And so maybe you feel some energy out there, maybe you don't. But you have to remember that this tribe, this Dogon tribe of Western Africa, are a Stone Age tribe. They possessed detailed mathematical, astronomical knowledge about the Sirius star system that wasn't even proven true until the 1970s, when a very powerful telescope for our time period, or that time period, was invented to prove, or wasn't invented to prove, but it ended up proving that what they were telling these anthropologists was real and was the truth. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, much like the book, The Sirius Mystery, in which you can find all of this information. We have to ask ourselves, how is it that a Stone Age tribe came by detailed astronomical, mathematical information regarding the Sirius star system that our astrophysicists didn't even know about? And what's really interesting is that it was their lineage they were genetically tested, and they traced their lineage back to ancient Egypt. Now, these two French anthropologists made friends with the holy men of the tribe. And the holy men of the tribe began to initiate them into their religious beliefs, in which they said that all of their knowledge came to them by way of non-human beings that they referred to as the Nomos. Now, it's very interesting because the Nomos were said to be an aquatic alien life form. And what are we seeing today all over the world, constantly reported nonstop? We are seeing USO reports, underwater submerged objects that are constantly coming up out of the ocean, flying around our nuclear-powered craft, flying around our nuclear installations, etc., and returning to the ocean again. And you know, the Dogon have a belief that the Nomos would return one day. And they call that day the Day of the Fish, and we'll talk about that too. But today is the Day of the Botto, and, you know, I came across this other exotic rabbit hole that we're also going to discuss that has perhaps a lot to do with all of this. And that is this whole idea of a holographic universe. Now, all of this fits into the holographic universe. We're going to talk about that. That's something very fascinating. You know, there's a famous game designer that's out there in the world, and let's see if I can come up with his name. His name is Rizwan Virk. Strange name, but he's from like India, or his family's from like India. So, but this guy was, you know, a Silicon Valley guy that hit it big and designed video games and still does, and he's a major success in all of that. And he's come out on a few podcasts talking about how really what they seem to have discovered by developing ever more realistic video games is what appears to be an underlying code to our reality matrix. In other words, it's really beginning to look like our reality as we perceive it to be is actually a simulation of some kind being run by another life form. Think about that, because that will twist your noodle for sure. But before we get to those two interesting things, I thought we would make an interesting observation of the fact that Whitley Strieber was also out there on the airwaves this week, and he also made some very interesting statements that are pertinent to all of this discussion. It's interesting how kind of all of this fits together in a way. So, but Whitley Strieber, in his abduction experiences, refers to what we would call aliens simply as the visitors. And he reiterated that during a recent interview, and the fact that he's not sure if from another planet. In fact, he has kind of an altogether different idea that we're going to examine. And, you know, I didn't know it, but these abduction experiences were so real and they happened so often that he was actually able to take people that he knew to that remote cabin, talking about Whitley Strieber, who wrote the world famous 2 million copies sold Communion, dealing with all of this. But he took actual people to that cabin that he knew, and those people experienced the same abduction phenomenon. So, I mean, and he openly says in the interview, yeah, these little guys would just walk right into the cabin sometimes, you know, and had a just number of truly bizarre experiences that, you know, it sort of stretches the whole line between what is this phenomenon really? Are these really aliens from another planet that are abducting people? Or is this something altogether different? Does it stretch into holographic theory, holographic universal theory, and the idea that we're actually in a hologram that is a simulation? And as Niels Bohr once put it, the only way you would ever know that you're in that simulation is when something is altered in the matrix around you. And we have, now that everybody is a walking camera, we have many, many dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of what appear to be little glitches in the so-called matrix. That's interesting stuff. So, And that fits into this whole holographic idea. In fact, Whitley Strieber's entire experience with the abduction phenomenon fits into the idea that the beings that abductees are seeing have something to do with the actual simulation that's being run. In other words, they're just doing a job. They're the arbitrators of the simulation. And we're going to get into this pretty deeply, because what if I told you that some of the same people that have done the ayahuasca trip or the DMT molecule trip have experienced some of the same higher up beings that abductees have come back reporting? And we'll get to that right after our break.
I'm Sarah, and this is my story.
I'm Ellen, and this is my story.
One night, I was at a bar. I was having fun with my friends.
I
had one too many drinks.
I
got behind the wheel to go home.
I got a cab to go home.
All of a sudden, from out of nowhere, a squirrel ran across the road.
It
happened so quickly, I barely had time to react.
The cabbie barely had time to react.
I swerved.
The cab swerved.
I can't believe it. I hit a guy.
I cannot believe it. The cabbie just missed a guy.
I wish I took a cab.
Thank goodness I took a cab.
You have the choice to save a life. Don't drive buzzed. It's a decision you'll never regret. Buzzed driving is drunk driving. Brought to you by the Department of Transportation and the Ad Council.
Ancient times to modern days. Legends of creatures in sudden disarray. Hear them speak through frequencies. Alien connections.
Break it out, truth untold. Tune it in, cosmic mystery. Dark woods where legends breathe. Paranormal whispers, can you believe? Bigfoot's the truth, no disguise. Cryptid shadows creeping near. Through the static, voice is clear. Dark woods where legends breathe. Paranormal whispers. Can you believe? It's the Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio. Wednesday night, enjoy the show. It's how we spend our Wednesday nights. Yay! Just crank that dial and dim the show. It's how we spend.
Welcome back, everybody, to Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio Live, and I am your host, Jack Carey, your tour guide to the Twilight Zone, and we are discussing yet another crazy line of evidence, crazy rabbit hole. Today's the day of the Bado, as I mentioned, and I could go into all of the great little detailed history of this tribe, but to make a long story short, these French anthropologists trace their lineage back to an ancient priest, a caste of priests in ancient Egypt. And each group of priests in ancient Egypt basically guarded their own particular secret of some kind. That's the beginning of the mystery schools, right? And a lot of these secrets came from survivors of Atlantis, which is interesting. But so they don't really know at what point in ancient history this knowledge came into being. Only that the Dogon believed that this knowledge was bestowed upon them by the Nomos, which is an aquatic alien race, they say traveled here from a watery planet somewhere in the Sirius star system. These creatures used to come up on the shore, they said. They would teach humanity all the lessons about, math and astronomy and all that kind of stuff, civilization, and then they would return to the world's oceans again. I find that truly fascinating because one of the major cyber prophecies is that over the course of this year, much of the world's attention will be turned to the world's oceans and the idea that there are vast numbers of aliens living there, right? So that kind of coincides with what they were saying. This whole event that occurred to them. What's really fascinating to me is the fact that they believe that the Nomos taught people how to actually build the pyramids, right? And what's interesting is that there's a discrepancy, a mathematical discrepancy that comes down to a very small fraction. And that very small fraction is for people who really want to know, is 0.0136, right? That's known as the particle of Pythagoras, but it's also the active mechanism for harmonic mathematics. That's fascinating, because whoever built the pyramids had to have known that to be the case for it to be exact that way. And the reason I say that is because the big pyramid at Giza, when you take the mass of that and you compare that to the mass of the second largest pyramid of Giza, the difference in their mass is the exact same difference, exact down to a fraction of 0.0136 of Sirius B and our star. In other words, the little thing that makes this little mathematical discrepancy that causes harmonic mathematics to work is present between Sirius and our star. So to make it easy, imagine that you're you're in a mansion and you can hear music playing, and you walk over to a room where there's a lady playing a violin at one end of the room. And at the other end of the room, there's a piano with the top propped open. And you walk over to the piano and you look down at it, and you can see each note that she's playing vibrate in the piano strings, right? So that's basic harmonic math at work, right? The idea that if you can vibrate at the same vibrational rate as another body of mass, you can cause change between the two without any sort of physical connection at all, simply through the fact that they're sharing a vibrational rate. That mechanism, that relationship exists between Sirius and our star, which would indicate that this isn't a unique relationship at all. It actually indicates that this is an underlying structure of the universe itself, that between stellar bodies exist these harmonic laws of vibratory energy, and that really kind of makes the universe much like a giant music machine of vibratory energy, right? And you can see a reality where a pulse, there's been a pulse recorded coming from like the center of our galaxy, but what if one of these pulses of energy comes out every so often from the center of the universe, and it travels through every single star system through this mechanism, through this harmonic mechanism, this vibratory energy. And it's through that mechanism that all biological life is affected throughout the universe, or at least throughout our own galaxy. That's the idea that the Dogon had. And that was the idea that they said that the Nomos gave to them, right? That's fascinating. But where it really gets even more fascinating, and where it sort of segues into this whole holographic universal idea, this idea that maybe you and I are actually living in somebody else's simulation program. How would we know the difference? You know, Elon Musk even said, imagine that there's a world like the Earth, and that there's a civilization that gets advanced enough on that world that it begins to create billions of other simulated worlds and realities. If that's the case, then the odds of us being on base reality is 1 in billions. So you have to ask yourself, what are the odds that we are, in fact, just a simulated reality created probably on another world somewhere? Maybe the Earth doesn't really exist. This is the kind of mind-bending noodle of a rabbit hole that you go down, right, when you begin to examine this. But what I say is, where this crosses over is the fact that this same apparent mechanism, this harmonic vibratory energy mechanism that can cause change between matter and mass in this reality structure, appears to be present in human biology. In other words, there are vibratory energy zones throughout the human body that we refer to as chakras, which literally is Sanskrit and means wheel of light. Well, light is in and of itself vibratory energy. Many of the ancient mystery schools teach that you can control the vibratory rate of each one of those zones throughout the body. This would be a continuation of the same knowledge, only being applied to the biology of humans. This is the basis for all magical belief on this planet. All magical practices where they believe you can cause some type of change in the matrix conformity through will alone can take place. And I have to ask the question, if you're living in a matrix, if you're living in a holographic simulation of some kind, might there be ways in which to sort of hack the code? And if you can hack the code, would that equate to a lot of the secrets that were encapsulated in ancient human mystery schools around the world? That's a very, very interesting question, right? But here is where we enter into really crazy zone, because this ties back into Whitley Strieber this week. I'm telling you, it was quite a week, because every direction I turned for Cryptid Corner, which I will mention here in a minute, or Paranormal in the News, Cyber Prophecy, Main Topic, they were all coming back to the same notion that there's something not quite right with our reality structure. Our perception of reality is skewed. And even Plato wrote about the cave, the allegory of the cave, in which he believed the reality that we all see is like people sitting in a cave watching shadows on the wall. Every once in a while, somebody gets tapped on a shoulder and they look around, or they realize that there's something causing the image, and they look around and see a light cracking through, and they make their way up out of that cave. And those are the people that are enlightened, right? So this idea that we're living in some sort of carefully constructed illusion goes all the way back into ancient times. Even goes all the way back to the Gnostics, who believed that this reality was actually created by something that nobody really suspects, something that we would find nefarious. So that's interesting perspective on all of this. But what if the simulation, let's entertain this notion that the simulation is being run, that we are inside that simulation, that it was constructed by what we would consider to be a non-human intelligence, right? What are the different scenarios that you can play with in light of that? Is it possible, for example, that you and I are actually just avatars inside of a holographic video game being played by an alien species of some kind? If not, why not? What if I told you that Whitley Strieber this week said that he got the feeling that the visitors of all of his abduction experiences were somehow arbitrators of this very thing, that they were outside the hologram, that they were like in the movie The 13th Floor, for instance, for movie fanatics out there, you'll know what I'm talking about, or Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, for example, the idea that there could be multiple timelines and multiple universes, all of that. But he got the feeling that the visitors were outside of our ideas of time and space. right? That's interesting because in the abduction phenomenon, many abductees have come back saying that the little gray beings that actually took them from their home or from a wooded location, etc., and brought them on board an alien craft were actually being instructed to do so by what appear to be what they describe as being praying mantis-like beings, right? Well, what if I told you, and these praying mantis beings, by the way, they're the bosses. They give the orders, the little gray beings carry out those orders, and everybody appears to just be doing a job. In other words, there doesn't appear to be any sort of malevolence taking place. I also might add, before I move on to this other little shocking factoid, is that during the abduction, these beings, these little gray beings, have the ability to basically remove the lens, because those big black oval eyes that's actually a lens covering the real eye. When they take that off, they can peer into your eye and they can seize the optic nerve to your brain. They then can project images into the optic nerve like you were really seeing them. It's because of that they can overlay images onto memory. I have to ask you, what are the odds that some alien species living off in the vast darkness of the universe somehow evolved an ability to seize the optic nerve of the human species? In other words, what I'm getting at is these beings had to be created to do exactly what they are doing, or there's some sort of relationship here that we're not quite understanding. And I don't believe that they're time travelers from the future, humans that have come back because we somehow bred ourselves out of existence. That really doesn't fit the puzzle pieces. But what if I told you that people taking ayahuasca and DMT have come across identical praying mantis beings? And to them, the praying mantis beings appear to be arbitrators of this, whatever it is, the simulation, this hologram, this reality, carefully constructed, illusory reality matrix that we're in, right? But what are the odds that abductees, completely independent of people that were seeking some sort of psychedelic enlightenment, come back reporting the same beings? And a lot of people that have done, ayahuasca and DMT come back reporting, saying that they have seen the actual grid lines of the matrix itself. What does that tell us? Strieber went on to say in his interview that he suspects that we're in some type of prison. It's a holographic prison of some kind. And as I stated earlier, now that the cell phone is literally embedded in the hand of every single human being, and it seems like all around the world, we are all walking cameras. So the programmers, let's call them that, I like that. The programmers aren't perfect. Their coding doesn't appear to be perfect. And there's little glitches that show up. And we're calling those glitches in the Matrix, right? Just like in the Matrix films, just like in the 13th Floor, just like in Man in the High Castle, and Philip K. Dick's well, I forget if he wrote the 13th floor or not, but in the 13th floor, they asked the question, when is one of these guys going to crawl up the extension cord and strangle their god to death? Right? And is that the human species? Are we eventually going to make our way out of this prison of a hologram, if that's what it is, this simulation? It could be, and, you know, this game designer brought this up, that they could restart the simulation over and over again. It could be that you have really strange memories that didn't really happen because it was part of another simulation. Think about that. You might actually be appearing in a number of different simulations, all taking place simultaneously. You know, with you have a little bit of ability to say to choose this or that path, but there's always going to be certain highlights in the journey as a character within that particular simulation. And that calls into questions, philosophical questions of determinism, you know, and a lot of religious questions about what created the universe itself. What if I told you guys that not long ago, the James Webb telescope, took a picture of like billions of galaxies. It was the biggest picture of galaxies ever taken. And it's cool to look at because when you look at it, you think to yourself, wow, that's a lot of stars. No, those are all galaxies, and every one of those galaxies has billions of stars in it. Right? That's how tiny we are. Tiny little speck of nothing dust in the middle of nowhere, if we are to believe what we are seeing, right? And the weird part about it was that all of those galaxies were rotating in the same direction. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen unless we are, all of us, and all the galaxies that we can see are inside of a gigantic black hole of some kind. But black holes are interesting because the mass, the amount of information, let's say, that can be contained within a black hole is actually determined by the surface of its mouth. In other words, it's like they determine it like it's a flat surface. And they're beginning to suspect that everything we see around us is nothing but vibratory energy of data. You know, they're devising such finely tuned measurement devices that they can take a brand new computer and measure its weight. And then they can fill that computer with data, and they can weigh it again, and it weighs more. In other words, information is mass, and mass is energy, and energy, never dissipates. It only changes form. And what are we looking at with paranormal phenomenon? Is it possible that the programmers of this reality matrix actually put in little pieces of code here and there to create paranormal effects in order to see what the responses will be? Because let's face it, when you're examining the reality matrix, it's the small little anomalies that tell you more about the nature of that reality than studying the static patterns. And that's what always, lured me to the paranormal, was in the pursuit of truth. It's through the anomalies that you get a better glimpse of the truth. And the anomalies are what we describe as paranormal. So, do we live in a grand simulated holographic reality experience? And is it possible that through our own biology, we can somehow hack into the reality matrix and cause change within it. I think that's what the ancient mystery schools had hidden at their heart. And all of that information is coming out these days. And is it possible? There are people, scientists out there in the world that are actively looking for a code to hack the matrix. And we will jump down another rabbit hole next week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Central. Stay tuned for Vixen's Vault. I'll see you next week.